Thank you. Well, hello. I'd like to thank Jerry and the lab, myself, for once again giving me the opportunity to speak at an art and science cafe. I'll just indulge me. I'm a little bit hoarse. I'm getting over a cold a little bit here. So if I'm a little hoarse, please bear with me. Yeah. So observation. What do an airplane, 3 birds, and this have to do with science here at the lab? As Jerry said, observation has been sort of much in my mind of late. It's what I've been thinking about as I'm making this work. And each of these paintings here represents a different mode of observation. This first one over here is my interpretation of a Cape May warbler. And this is here to represent the type of direct personal observation of nature by individuals with lay naturalists. I painted it in sort of a, I think, but it's sort of a nostalgic, almost traditional style, in part to reference the history of lay naturalists and painters who both explored Acadia in the early days and also other parts of the new American continent and documented what they saw. As many here at the lab will know, citizen science is an increasingly important tool in helping trained scientists understand either the presence or the absence and the population of specific target species within a region. Sadly, this little Cape May warbler is one of a number of species of carnivorous insectivores that appears to be coming to MDI less and less. Their primary food source is the maple and spruce budworm, and as the trees bud out sooner and sooner every spring, the food source comes and goes before this bird migrates up here. So they are being seen less and less. The next painting I have to show you, this one is titled Hurricane Hunter. And this is an example of a type of observation requiring very specialized expertise and specialized equipment. The plane in the painting is called a P-2B Neptune. It was built by Lockheed Corporation. Their primary purpose was during the Cold War, they were submarine chasers. They were reconnaissance aircraft that would deploy sonar buoys to hunt submarines, but they were also sometimes specially retrofitted to collect weather data. They would fly directly into hurricanes and Pacific typhoons, and they and the planes that are in use today provide a lot of very important data about the behavior and the formation of hurricanes. The final piece that I have in the show right here is titled The Parakeet and the Raven. And here I've turned my gaze inward for a different kind of observation of my own internal unconscious. I've been inspired by the writings of Carl Jung lately, and this painting narrates sort of a reflective journey, as I said, through my own unconscious. In our culture, ravens are very typically associated with death and with mourning, but in many cultures around the world, ravens are also associated with knowledge and wisdom. And in Jungian psychology, they're closely associated with the shadow psyche or the unconscious. And here the story is that I placed a very vocal parakeet up above the raven. The parakeet is common in captivity and is capable of mimicking human speech. And so sort of the narrative of the painting is that the parakeet is acting out, is vocalizing the secret fears, motivations, and desires of the sort of silent but knowing raven who lets that information sort of bubble up the branching ways of the psyche to him. The tree sort of, and its branching sort of representing the psyche there. I brought one other painting to show you that is not in the show here. It's come directly out of my studio. It may not be finished yet. I don't always know for a while whether or not it's finished. But it's another sort of examination of sort of an internal thought process, and I brought it here tonight to sort of clue you in on an evolving thought process that's going on with me. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is this interesting feature of human nature. We don't seem to like random, unexplained things very much. Whether it's stars in the night sky, or lucky or unlucky turn of the cards in poker, we look for meanings and explanations for what we observe, and where we don't find one ready-made, we tend to invent them. So we create constellations with pictures and invent stories and mythologies around stars. We bring all manner of lucky talismans to Vegas with us when we go to play cards, etc., and all to avoid having to accept that these things might just be completely random and out of our control. Formation is what I call a process piece, is about that search for meaning. And when I say process piece, what I mean is that it's sort of defined by its process of making. And in this case, it starts with a couple of layers of plaster applied directly to this panel here. And over the course of working that plaster with a trowel, sort of random modeling of the surface begins to appear. And then I add a couple of layers of oil paint to that. Add the oil paint and sometimes wipe it away, add it, wipe it away. And over the course of time, these little bits of sort of proto-form start to emerge in the piece. To me, I see in there maybe like a subterranean cave with stalactites or something. My point is that I want to tickle your own desire to find meaning, to find form in the image without actually satisfying it. I want you to experience the question of what am I looking at, and then sort of investigate your, experience your own mental process of trying to answer that question. Okay, so that's my work, and now I'll get on to the rest of my talk about observation. To preface, let me just say that I'm going to present some ideas from art history, from science, from psychology, and I'm not an expert in any of those fields, so I'm just presenting ideas here that have influenced my work and the work of other artists that I've looked at over the years. So we'll start with Isaac Newton. It turns out that our understanding of observation has changed a fair amount over the last 100 years or so. And to begin to get a look at the scope of that, I'll first start by looking back with Isaac Newton here. In 1687, he published his masterwork, Principia, in which he laid out the basic foundation of his laws of motion and universal gravitation. Successive generations of scientists and naturalists built on that work to the point that in the late 19th century, the general view in physics was that Newton's basic foundation offered a pretty complete worldview of how the planets and stars moved about in the heavens. And during the same sort of period that was evolving, art had, and when I say art, I'm talking almost exclusively of Western European and American painting, because that's what I personally know. But art over the same period had presented a worldview in pictures that was largely consistent with Newton's view of the cosmos, with conventions of proportion and of perspective that were introduced in the early Italian Renaissance. Artists were creating a very rationally delineated space and arranging objects within that space that more or less mimic what you could see with the naked eye when you looked out the window. And we have a gentleman by the name of Leon Battista Alberti to thank for that worldview. He was a 15th century Florentine architect In 1435, he wrote a treatise called On Painting. And in that treatise, he wrote, "All steps of learning should be sought from nature, though by different skills at the same goal, namely that as near as possible the work that they, the artists and painters, have undertaken, shall appear to the observer to be similar to the real objects of nature." For a little over 400 years, that essential view in Western painting largely was intact. And together with Newton's classical mechanics, a fairly consistent and rational view in both science and painting began to emerge. Space was a seamless tableau upon which nature acted out her divine pageant. Planets and stars moving about in predictable orbits, and all understandable. Within that worldview was implicit, a sort of implicit understanding of the role of the observer, that it was fundamentally passive. And there were definitely philosophical traditions that took a very different take on that, but within sort of the science and certainly in the artistic view of the period, largely, observation was seen as fundamentally passive. We were just watching God's divine clockwork unfold. Some major upheavals in both art and science began to take place in the early 19th and 20th centuries. Big one for art was the invention of the Daguerreotype by Louis Daguerre in, I think it was 1836, if I recall correctly, or 1839. The principle of the camera obscura had been known for centuries, but it wasn't until Daguerre's photographic process that it became possible, commercially viable, to fix a photographic image on a plate. And JMW Turner, the great British painter, was reported to have said, in response to seeing this new photographic process, that it was going to put painters out of work. Of course, quite the opposite happened. Freed from Alberti's constraint of having to represent the natural world, painters were open to being able to explore light and color in the absence of form in ways they'd never been licensed to do before. In works like Snowstorm, Turner himself is showing some very early signs of a revolution in painting that would take place in Europe and then later in America. He was criticized at the time for having abandoned form entirely, but quite a number of artists would soon begin to follow him, and he's often seen as an early bridge to some of the Impressionist movement's fascination with the same sort of concepts. But there are also historians and art historians who believe that his work was also an early precursor of some of the abstract expressionists that came to be in America about 100 years later. So, where photography freed painters from form, Einstein's General Relativity, published in 1915, radically transformed our understanding of space, where in Newton's view, space was sort of a flat expanse of void through which planets and stars moved. Einstein showed that space and time are relative to motion, that space-time is curved, that it's full of holes, and may well be finite as well. They may not have known of each other's work. I'm not aware of any evidence that Einstein and Picasso were familiar with one another. But nevertheless, at about the same time, Picasso was beginning to upend the notion of a flat picture plane, in much the same way that Einstein was upending the notion of flat space. So you see here, whereas before looking at a painting was in Alberti's world meant to be like looking out a window, here all you're seeing are fractured planes and angles making up both the picture plane and the subject matter of the work itself. And interestingly, so Einstein's relativity was published in 1915. You see Picasso's a little ahead of him in 1910. So, I've been talking so far about a new understanding about what we see in space. I'll turn now to a new sort of understanding of our of observation itself, where relativity showed that space is not flat. Quantum mechanics shows that observation isn't passive. There are a number of examples of the odd, quirky behavior of nature at the subatomic scale, and there are a number of very good books. My favorite is QED by Richard Feynman that explain it in layman's terms. I'm not going to get into much depth with it here. I'll just say that in the quantum world, nothing is ever certain. And there were a lot of important contributions in the early days of quantum mechanics, but none is, well, at least this one is right at the center of them. This is the Schrodinger's time-dependent wave function equation. And there are many derivations of it, but in a nutshell, it's a means of expressing the changes in a quantum system through time. And the important part to remember about it is that it can't make a decision. It's not capable of predicting an outcome. All it can do is record the many possibilities of the way something can go. And this led to what's called the Copenhagen Interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is simply that the act of observation and measurement itself is what decides the outcome of any specific event. So when I toss this coin, right now, according to the Copenhagen interpretation, the coin under my hand is both heads and tails. It exists in what's called a superposition of states. And the decision won't be made until the very moment that I look at it. And we can see that it's tails. So again, this is my way of saying that, that observation is part of the determining factor in how nature unfolds. And that change in understanding wasn't unique to physics. A French psychiatrist named Jacques Lacan in, I think it was 1936, proposed his idea of mirror stage development in infant children. And you want to talk about a dense formulation of a theory. That one is, I think I spent about 5 hours reading 10 pages in college on this thing. So I'm not going to get into it here, but the point of bringing it up is that the mirror stage thesis was part of a larger body of work that Lacan did, understanding how observation functioned psychologically within the individual and functioned in the group, communally, between people. His work on observation, or as he called it, the gaze, was very influential in postmodern circles among academics who began to see this gaze as something external to the viewer, as something that existed sort of in the space between the viewer and the subject. And this work itself went on to influence a generation of postmodern artists. Among them, the great German painter Gerhard Richter. He's still alive and working. And he wrote of his own work, "What determines me at the deepest level in the visible is the gaze which is outside." And in this painting of this beautiful painting of this girl reading a newspaper, Richter is essentially creating, well, in her refusal to sort of acknowledge Richter or us in the picture, right? He's subtly shifting the subject of the painting away from the girl and to our own act of voyeurism in looking at her. Okay, so that becomes the true subject of the work. Whatever, for myself, whatever the validity of Lacan's mirror stage hypothesis, I think what gets established for me is the notion that observation mediates the boundary between our inside world and our outside world. And at whatever stage, Lacan was talking about an early infant stage, whatever stage the process begins, very, very early in life we become aware of a kind of terrifying truth that we are separate beings, separate and apart from a vast external otherness out there. And I'll return to that thought at the end of my talk. So, since observation, or the gaze if you prefer, seems to be a bit more complicated than meets the eye, no pun intended, I thought I'd take you in a quick trip through the eyes and into the brain for a look at what's going on when we look at something. Despite the fact that our eyes are in the front of our head, we process information in the very back of our brain in the occipital lobes. But different things do handle different specific functions. The brain is modular, like a car assembly line in that way. And within the occipital lobes, there are different regions that process faces, that process objects and landscapes. Even light, color, and contrast are all processed in slightly different regions in the brain. And for a kind of fascinating look at the brain's modularity, we can look at a very famous American painter named Chuck Close. He suffers from a condition called prosopagnosia. And he suggested that condition played a part in his development of these monumental portraits that he makes. And when I say monumental, they're 6, 8 feet tall. I've seen him working on them in a documentary and he's got this whole elevator system that raises and lowers the paintings. It's quite remarkable. But anyway, prosopagnosia is a condition in which the face part of his brain is damaged. He can navigate through the world, he can recognize objects, he can recognize places, but he can't recognize your face. Even his closest friends and associates appear as complete strangers to it. So, in addition to being modular, the brain also operates in parallel distribution. And that means that lots of different regions work together at the same time so that we can both process visual information and our emotional response simultaneously, virtually simultaneously. I think latest I read is that when we look at somebody new that we meet, we form snap first impressions about whether we like or don't like them in about 1/10 of a second. So it happens almost immediately. And so I thought we could take a look at a painting you might be familiar with from the lab's card. This is Frederick Church's painting of Otter Creek from 1850. So what's happening in your brain right now? And I assume most of you find this painting to be beautiful to look at, as I do. What is happening right now in your brain is that your occipital lobes, as we said, are processing the visual data, light, color, shadow, in different regions. Your limbic system, which is underneath the surface of your brain, is processing your emotional response to the piece. The basal ganglia is the driver in a loop of neural circuits that control the reward system in your brain, so you're getting maybe a little dopamine rush if you really like the painting. And lastly, all of that is connected up to the autonomic nervous system, so that if you're really excited about what you're seeing, your heart rate might beat a little bit faster. And all of that is happening in the computer between your ears. And it's, and also you're processing the sound of my voice, which is a completely different set of neural circuits. And it's all being done on a computer running on less energy than an old incandescent light bulb, about 25 watts to be exact. Yeah, pretty amazing. So in this last section, I have been referencing a very interesting book that I read a while back. It's by Anjan Chatterjee. It's called The Aesthetic Brain, and it talks a lot about the neurology of aesthetics. And it also his main subject in the work is whether or not art played a significant and meaningful role in our evolution as a species. And that is another huge topic that I won't get into here, but it's a wonderful book and I highly recommend it. Anyway, so some final thoughts for me. The picture of art, when it comes to understanding how our brains process it, is actually very complicated. I was corresponding with an acquaintance of mine a little while ago who is doing some interesting work studying brain scans of musicians as they perform. And counterintuitively, what he finds is that the part of the brain, it's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is associated with motor control, executive functioning, and so forth, it actually powers down, becomes quieter when a musician is in the act of performing. He thinks it's what we refer to as being in the zone, where our actions become sort of automatic. Conversely, listeners listening to that same piece of music in a recital hall will probably experience a great deal of heightened activity in the brain. And then lastly, I was recently reading about a study done on two groups of people. One group participated in an art class where they both learned about and made their own artwork. The other group was really more of just a study class. And what they found is that the part of the brain associated with cognitive processing and memory showed increased activity and heightened connectivity, whereas the brain scans of people who only learned about art showed far less change. So it appears that there are lots of different kinds of things going on in the brain when we look at or make or experience art. And what does it all mean? Well, this is only my own speculation, but I wonder if it's all about finding meaning. And I know that that sounds kind of warm and fuzzy, but remember, I spoke before about the powerful need human beings have to find meaning and pattern in our lives. And there's good reason for that. With only 25 watts of electricity to work with, we don't have much power with which to do a great deal. And it turns out that keeping track of a bunch of extraneous, meaningless events in our lives takes a great deal of energy to attend to all that. So there is nothing, at least in my mind, that connects more to that sort of core of meaning in our human experience than that fundamental alienation I talked about before. And it's been written about and it's been painted about in our civilization for millennia, from the expulsion from Eden to the existentialist critiques of modern man. This alienation from the divine, from ourselves, and from the external world has been sort of a central component of our unique, perhaps unique, human experience. In my own creative process, what I experience is a desire to recreate, often fantastically, the world I see around me, things that I read about. And when I'm engaged in that process, I feel a kind of connection for it. And so I wonder if what I'm trying to do is sort of recapture something that was separated from me, or perhaps that I'm merely trying to symbolically possess something I covet. I'm not really sure. But I wonder if it's a way of trying to recover from that fundamental alienation, or in other words, if observation first showed me the separateness of my existence. I wonder if maybe I'm trying to paint my way back to wholeness. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Something I've wondered about my entire life, going to art museums. Are we all seeing the same thing? I mean, you're talking about the complexity of art. I mean, there are billions of neurons that we don't even know what they do yet. Again, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't speak authoritatively on it. I will just share my own little interpretation of what I believe. And that is that from neurology, we know that there is no one center of the brain that processes art. Many different regions process different emotional responses, as I said. And so the emotional context that we bring to the museum with us necessarily colors what our experience of that work of art is. So no, I don't think that we all do see the same thing. Well, maybe we all see the same thing, but I don't think we experience the same thing in the same way. Yeah.
I was glad to see this last frame that you pulled up. I believe that our environmental degradation that we experience today is related to this. This was the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm.
As a human discipline that should have been recognized and capable of preserving the environment, started to fall away a long time ago.
Mm.
And I believe that's where we are today. Our environment is falling away badly, and
Yep.
we fail to recognize it. We have that human intelligence, I believe, and the capability of reversing that process.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope. Yeah.
Ben, love the talk.
Thank you.
I see so many connections between scientists
Mhm.
and artists, and so many similarities between scientists and artists. But one of them you just showed me today. I struggle as a scientist knowing when to be done with,
Mhm.
with a line of experimentation.
Yes.
When is it finished? When do I have enough data? When
Well,
do
you
I
might
go
as
to
well be an
publication?
artist. 'Cause
Exactly, and to hear you say that that beautiful piece of art beside you on your left
Yeah.
is not finished,
It's,
makes me think of, well, there's one more thing we have in common. Can you tell me about the 4 pieces up there? They all look beautifully finished to me.
they, you know,
but-
so much for me, the artistic process is very intuitive. So I was just explaining to somebody earlier, for instance, about this painting right here. I found myself painting things on that surface, no idea what they meant. And then they gradually, the sort of meaning behind it sort of revealed itself to me over time. And that process is ongoing. So even after, you know, a painting may be finished for a year, I'll look at it and find some new thought or some new meaning around it. And so, yeah, when I say that a work often takes a very long time for me to understand whether or not it's finished, it may never be finished. The truth of the matter is, you know, I can't think of too many things that I wouldn't, you know, that I wouldn't at least consider going back and working on. But yeah, it's often a very sort of, as it may well be in science as well, it's often a very arbitrary decision that you make about, you know, okay, I'm done. I've worked on this now for X number of days, weeks, months. I'm done. Yeah. Yeah.
Has working with a scientist here changed the type of artist you have become?
God, that's an interesting question. You know, I'm not sure if it's changed the kind of artist that I am. It's certainly broadened my horizon for the type of art that I'm interested in and for the types of ideas that I'm interested in exploring. And as Robert was talking about earlier, certainly it's very sort of personally intriguing to see the many and varied connections between artistic and scientific processes. But, you know, so, yeah, I suppose probably in some ways it has, because, I mean, just for instance, my work with Dustin Updike a couple of years ago, he showed me this process where he removed a little bit of genetic material from this worm stem cell, and the worm stem cell turned into a neuron. And I was very intrigued with the process that when you take away this sort of stem cell property of it, it turns into a neuron, which is all about neurology, and now I'm reading books on aesthetic neurology and stuff. So yeah, I would definitely say that more than any specific thing that I can say that it's changed about my work, it's just changed, you know, sort of in general, my interests in a broader range of topics and subjects. Yeah. Yeah.
Picking up the thread of when is something finished,
Mm-hmm.
if there's any truth to the theory that the more we learn, the less we know,
Mm-hmm.
it may be that finished is an impossible possible state to achieve.
Yeah, as I think may have been evident in what I said earlier, I'm not sure that anything really ever is finished. As I said, meanings so often continue evolving for me. You know, I think that probably is true of art in general. I mean, just take that painting for example. I mean, the meaning of these paintings that we have in our museums can be understood differently by every successive generation and find new meaning. And that's part of, you know, I think what makes art alive and significant in our culture. Yeah?
What's your opinion as an artist versus most of us who are lay people? Pro or con for artistic statements posted next to works?
You know, the truth is I don't have a hard or fast opinion on that. I mean, I think for so many things, you know, things are subjective. I'm sure for some people, they're very, I think that, I understand that there's probably different opinions on it, and some people find it intrusive and want to find their own meanings. I also think that there are probably other people who really enjoy learning something that they didn't, a thought that they might not have had on their own. So I guess I can't offer a pro or a con. I think it depends on the individual. That it? Okay. Thank you. My pleasure.